Let's start over real quick because I wasn't recording. So thanks everyone for joining tonight. Today we're going to talk about the ideas of progress versus conservation, and particularly in terms of today's human environment, and more specifically in regards to identity politics, because I think people confuse being conservative and liberal with the ideas of progress and conservation. So when I'm talking about these forces, what I mean are the forces that really affect human existence today. On one hand, you have conservation, and that's the force that keeps us connected to our human story. On the other hand, you have progress, and this is the force of evolution, adaptation, change, the thing that increases complexity in our lives and builds meaning. So on one hand, you have the thing that allows us to hold on to meaning and connect our past meaning to today, and that's conservation. And on the other hand, you have progress, which allows us to create new meaning and adapt to the future. Now, these things are not opposing ideas per se, but there is a tension between them. The way I envision progress and conservation working when they do work is that progress pulls us forward. It's the thing that keeps us from stagnating and dying as a species. While on the other hand, conservation keeps us connected to who we are and helps us understand our place in the universe. Without progress, we stagnate and die. Without conservation, we become unmoored from the meaning that we've developed over millennia, and we lose sight of who we are. And I think what we've seen recently, in the way I envision it, is it's like a bungee cord between the two things. And if the bungee cord becomes too taut and the forces are pulling too hard against each other, it'll break. And that's where you get unrest in a society, in civilization. So I think this is a really important idea for us to understand today, because if we don't, what we'll have is some who are in the conservation camp and they don't want to move anywhere, which means that they're anchoring humanity in a place where we can't progress. And then the people on the side of progress continue to progress without trying to remain connected to our history and our past, and end up being uninformed about what should be done going forward. And again, these are not political ideas. This is not liberals and conservatives or Democrats and Republicans. These are forces that drive what happens to humanity. Now, a little bit earlier, I mentioned the idea of meaning, right? On one hand, conservation connects us to the meaning that's been generated thus far. And on the other hand, progress, or the idea of progress, helps us to create new meaning or meaning in new ways. Now, from the humanist perspective, and our humanist perspective in particular, we look at meaning as the ultimate value of human existence. So it's not just the human life or the human soul or whatever it is, it's the meaning that we impart into the collective human memory. Because if you think about throughout history and then project it as far forward into the future as you can fathom, it's not that any one person was alive or that humans were alive. It's just that the memories and the meaning that humans have created over time continues. That's the prime directive, if you will. And so it's critically important both to remain connected to the meaning that we've created and to continue progressing in ways that, one, keep humanity alive, but two, allow us to continue to progress. And so that's, I think, very important. So the reason I think this is important, even at the smallest scale, is because as an individual, the meaning that we create is the thing that survives us, right? So in my particular view of humanism, I personally don't believe in an afterlife or a transcendent soul that's going to exist after I'm gone. I do, however, believe in physics, and physics says that you can't destroy energy, only that energy changes forms. And so the way I think about my meaning is that the time that I invest in other people, in my children, in my community, in humanity, is the meaning that I create that survives me. And I become part of the human condition. So Meaning is incredibly important, both on the side of conservation and on the side of progress. And so we all generate ripples of meaning, I think, that spread out through our connections into all of humanity. And some may have just tiny impact, but they all have impact to a certain extent. And what would our actions mean if humanity was wiped out tomorrow? I'd argue that all of human existence would all of a sudden become meaningless. It would have been if we had never existed. So that means it's really important to balance progress with conservation, because if we ever stop moving, we will stagnate and die. But if we ever progress so fast that we end up killing ourselves by not being considered in our approach to progress, then we lose that way as well. So there are pitfalls on either side of this fine line that we walk into humanity's future. And so I think these ideas of progress and conservation are critically important. Now, what do they get us? There's a lot of debate, obviously, right now in the political environment about what is the end state that we're aiming for? And it sounds like we're talking about the ideas of progress and conservation, but I would argue we're not. We're arguing about stand-ins for those two ideas. When we think about the idea of progress, progress is something that should help us chart the course of human energy and direction and meaning creation in ways that are productive and keep the species alive so we continue to create meaning. Conservation should help us to understand that we are narrative creatures and that we have to maintain a connection to the places that we came from. Doesn't mean we stay the same. In fact, that would be, I argue, deadly in the long run, because anything that doesn't adapt will eventually die. But there is an important role that conservation has to slow down progress enough that we do it in a considered way. So arguably, when you think about the nuclear weapons, right? Nuclear weapons was a bit of human progress, a bit of a scientific progress, but arguably one that maybe we shouldn't have ever done. Maybe we should have thought about that one a bit more collectively, right? And that we're talking about this in, very theoreticals, before that was brought into play. Things like gene modification and modifying viruses have led to huge amounts of human progress in saving lives, but they also have downsides, and we can never quite tell what the outcomes will be until we reach those critical decision points, because every day humanity chooses a branch to follow and other branches are trimmed off and eliminated, and our available choices become narrower from what they once were. And every day that happens and new opportunities open up and others close. But it's important that we're balancing the ideas of progress and conservation as we go forward. Now, some of the ways that meaning is propagated is through this idea of complexity, right? And this is, again, a little bit in the sense of physics. Chaos is when everything is basically static, right? When energy is dispersed across the universe, when there is no structure to anything. There are no planets, there are no mountains, there's nothing built on top of each other. So the opposite of what it is that we aim for in creating more meaning is chaos. So said another way, what we're looking for is complexity, because complexity is the opposite of chaos. Now, with complexity comes challenges, right? And this is where conservation struggles, because it's really difficult to understand the complex nature of human meaning today, let alone just the fact that we have, billions of people on the planet. How do we fathom that? How do we fathom our actions in the context of the rest of humanity? And it's a hard question, but I think it's the most important one to grapple with, because unless we are thinking critically about how we affect the rest of humanity, then at some point, one human could make a choice that wipes out the rest of humanity. So we have to think about this idea of creating complexity, but using the concepts of progress and conservation to balance our approach to creating that complexity. If we lose too many people in the complexity that we create, then what happens is a reversion to tribalism, into the primordial brain that we have, or the primeval brain. Whereas we need to be using our front brain, which allows us to do things like rational thought and override our evolutionary emotional brain, which is useful for some things, but less so as you gain more complexity. So, how is it that we think about these things? Again, it's not just more humans, it's more complexity, more meaning. So, if you've never read this book, so this is Thinking Fast and Slow, I would recommend it. So, it talks about system one and system two thinking. So, system one thinking is your instinct, your emotions. It's how you react on your built-in human operating system checklist that you had basically since you were a younger kid. You react to stimuli, you feed yourself, you take care of yourself, so on. System two thinking is where you use your front brain and you really reason through what it is that you're doing. One of the reasons that we started the Humanist Church is to come up with a better social operating system, a broader human operating system than the past philosophies or religions that we've had to choose from. Because system two thinking, using your front brain, takes a ton of energy. So the best thing to do is to set up good rules for yourself, right? Good standard operating procedures that you don't have to think about all the time. Today we think about things like recycling and, commuting via public transportation versus using our car. And when we build these things into our mind, we're generally choosing better actions. And we just don't have to think about the specific reasoning behind how much gas do I burn and how much CO2 does that create and how does that affect other people in the local area, let alone global warming, right? That would be a complicated way to get to work every day. So we've got to use our front brain to think really hard about things and try and solve them for communities. And then we share those ideas so that we're, one, specializing and saving time, but two, spreading those best ideas. So then we can mostly rely on that rear brain to just make sure we're following the checklist and then flag things when we're not. And we make those initial programs, if you will, using the ideas of progress and conservation. So I want to give some kind of specific political examples. When we talk about things like global warming, there are subsets of the population for whom that is not nearly as relevant as the most immediate threat to their system one thinking, which is they don't have secure jobs that help them provide for their families. So using our system two thinking, we have to realize that, yes, it does make sense for us to invest in clean energy and mitigate global warming. But if we do it in such a way that we alienate a large percentage of the population, then what we have is civil unrest, which then prevents us from implementing the programs that we think will actually get us there. So there's a balance between bringing people with you and aiming for the future. So in the past, there had not been good investment in those populations, which traditionally were Republican versus Democratic, which were more concerned about the environment. Because the way our political system is built, at least in the US, is that wasn't part of the Democratic constituency. So why would they invest jobs and resources in a political group that was likely not going to vote for them? And so I would argue this happened during the Obama administration. And what happened then was we saw a huge amount of backlash. And to me, that was when the bungee cord between progress and conservation broke, or at least frayed significantly. And the conservatives basically, and again, talking the general idea of conservation, not conservatives in terms of Republicans, really dug in their heels because they had become unmoored from their history and their ideas. They didn't understand their place in the new world. And so then they became resistant to all progress and wanted to revert back to something in their minds, which is a myth of these better days when something was different before. And granted, again, if you're using your system one thinking, it's easier to give into fear and emotions. So that breakage occurred, and now we're having to fix it, which is taking us far more time than if we had kept it connected to begin with. So I give you that example to help you think about when you're engaging with people. We've talked about this in the last couple of weeks. When you're engaging with people, you have to help them come along if they're one of those people that leans on the conservative side. Because if you're not bringing people along with you, then we're losing our connection to human meaning as a group, as a species, and we're going to break our ability to continue to move forward as a species. Now, I know that's a challenge for a lot of us who really believe in the ideas of progress. And if we could only do X, Y, and Z, we would be okay. But we have to realize that humans are still animals to an extent. We just have this higher level operating system, that system two thinking, that allows us to transcend the animals we are. But you got to train really hard to use that thinking process. And so you have to help the other folks come along if they're not quite there yet. And this gets back to the idea of being a humble human, that we were all at some point idiots, right? Very few of us grew up with the ideas and the education and the reflection that we now have. So how do we help others go through those same processes? To me, this idea of progress versus conservation is one of those critical ways, because I believe that everyone would agree that we need to continue to progress. But they would also argue that there's some level of narrative, and again, humans are narrative creatures, that we have to bring with us. So, how do we go about this? We have to build human connections. And this really requires us to invest the energy, and energy is how you build complexity, right? If you've ever studied physics, it takes energy to stack things up, and it releases energy when you knock things down. So if we're going to build a complex society that brings everyone with us, or the most of everyone, there are going to be some people that fall behind or choose to stay behind, I should say. But you have to invest energy in them, in your community, in your family to move it all forward. And so we have to study, we have to educate ourselves, we have to educate others, we have to invent and build, and then we have to put in the maintenance and sustain our societies, our communities, our environment to make sure that we can continue to move forward. And generally, we've got to oppose this idea of entropy, right? The idea of chaos. And it's not that chaos is a group of people. This is, this isn't a Bond movie, or this isn't an action flick. Chaos is simply a force that continuously degrades things over time. So only with great energy can we continue to move forward. So what does this look like in today's world? Be kind to others, consider their perspective, be an example for others to emulate, speak out for what is right, but help people understand why you hold that belief. And then join with others and hold systems accountable. Again, educate ourselves, starting with ourselves, then our families, then our communities, so that we can really move things forward. And to me, education is the single biggest and best investment in the future of humanity, because it's about human meaning, which requires humans to be part of the process. And then again, we have to understand this value between progress and conservation, between innovation and tradition. But we do have to progress, because if we don't, we stagnate and die, and we also can't lose our human narrative. And so finally, what we need to do is expand our sense of self to encompass our community and encompass our society and encompass our nation and then the rest of the world. We have to realize that we as individuals are the rest of humanity. And it goes back to the good old golden rule, right? Treat others as you would want to be treated. Because the more that happens, the more it becomes a reality. So with that, thank you very much for joining us today. I hope this helped you to consider some of the chaos that we're seeing in today's world. And then ideally, we can build toward the complexity needed for humanity to progress. Thank you. Have a great evening.